Okay, great. Well, as people probably know from presentations I've done before, I have always been interested in the unusual ships that are connected to Pearl Harbor. When we think of Pearl Harbor ships in general, our minds tend to go to the battleship row and the great fighting ships that were within the confines of Pearl Harbor itself. And as collectors, we really know those ships quite well and the covers associated with them. But December 7th also involved other locations on Oahu, and one of those was Honolulu Harbor. Uh, Portions of both the first and second wave of the attacking Japanese planes visited Honolulu. They strafed, they dropped bombs. Although the damage was minimal, there were about 30 civilians that were killed that day. At the time, Honolulu Harbor had quite a number of vessels. We don't hear much about them because, again, we tend to think of Navy ships. Typically, Honolulu Harbor has had a mixture of all kinds of types of vessels, from large commercial liners, freighters, inter-island ships, Coast Guard ships, Army transports, dredges, other Army engineers vessels, tugs, barges, fishing boats, yachts, quite an interesting array. And the ships that were there are not as well documented as Navy ships. In fact, there really is no complete list. I've spent quite a bit of time over the years doing, I guess I would call it pure research, trying to identify ships that were present of various kinds, regardless of whether there may or may not be covers associated with them. But in the process, learning something about the ships that were there did lead me to find covers of various sorts. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today are the covers that I can associate with Honolulu Harbor. First, we're going to look at a couple of maps. One just to show the relationship of Honolulu to Pearl Harbor. One is going to look at the Honolulu Harbor itself, just to give you a general idea of the layout. And then we're going to look at the individual ship covers. And the order that I'm going to go is basically Navy ships, Coast Guard ships, Army vessels, commercial vessels, and some other miscellaneous things. So it should be fun. Actually, this opening photograph is interesting because it shows one of the big Matson liners going through the channel into Honolulu Harbor. And as you'll see, on the left is Sand Island, and on the right is the territorial dock, or Fort Armstrong. Directly in front of the ship, you'll see the Aloha Tower, and then distant berths we'll talk about in just a little bit, because every section of the harbor was slightly different. Here we go. This is a general map that shows Pearl Harbor and Honolulu. As the crow flies, it's probably about 4 miles to get from one to the other. But if you're in a boat, you have to go through the channel, past the section base, and then make a hard right and along Fort Island, where the battleship row was, and down here where the Navy Yard was. But if you're driving, it was pretty direct. This is a map of Honolulu Harbor that I cobbled together a few years ago. I think it actually comes from 1942. I added the numbers that you see for the piers in the approximate location. And starting down here at the entrance again, you have Sand Island on the left and Fort Armstrong. Quarantine Island is historically exactly what it said. That's where the ships that came in that might have smallpox would be tied up at Quarantine Island for a period of time as the harbor and area was dredged out. Sand Island built up more and more. To the right, you see Fort Armstrong, which isn't exactly a fighting fort. It was a quartermaster fort, mainly supply warehouses, things like that, which makes sense as shipping comes in for Army use. That's where they would handle it. As a consequence, the Army also had a number of vessels associated with ships that came into the harbor. The Coast Guard had a base here at Pier 4. They also had a buoy shop right over here on Sand Island. Because if you know your history, it wasn't really a Coast Guard base at first. It was a lighthouse service. They had the lighthouse tender would be here. The lighthouse buoys would be over here. 1915, the Coast Guard was created, and they started sharing that space. And we'll get into some of that in a little bit. This general area is where the Aloha Tower is. This is where the great commercial liners would come in and tie up. The Lurleen, the Malolo, the various Matson lines, the other lines as well. This section right here is what I call the tug area. A lot of the commercial tugs from Young Brothers would tie up there. They would get their orders to go out and do various jobs. You also had the Inter Island ships, Inter Island Steamship Company, the commercial Pacific Cable Company would have a vessel up in this area. The newer parts of Honolulu Harbor at that time were over here. In 1941, the Army was using this area up here, as well as some of the freighters, commercial freighters would come in. Historically, the Army would be down in this area. This is where the Army Engineer Office was. Pier 5 is where the Army and the Navy over the years shared from time to time. And a lot of the Army vessels that were here at the time of the attack historically would have been over in this area. And that includes a dry dock that you'll see in pictures of it a little bit. Historically, it was just right in this area, Inter Island Dry Dock. But at the time of the attack, they had moved a lot of those operations over here, and she was tucked in right about there. This outer area here is where a lot of the commercial freighters would come in, and the Navy supply vessels and cargo vessels. So it was really quite an active place. The first Navy ship that we're going to look at is the USS Vega, basically a cargo ship. And she was over in the area that I just pointed out a minute ago, at Pier 31 in the newer area. She was spent a lot of time transporting materials and personnel and whatnot up in Alaskan waters. And in November 1941, she was in Bremerton. This cover is not from the ship. It's official mail from the ship, but it's postmarked at Bremerton. About 3 days later, she got underway for Wana, Oregon, which is just pretty close to where I live. It's maybe 30 miles up the river from the mouth of the Columbia. And she went into the lumber mill at Wana and took on a load of lumber. And on the way out on November 21st, she stopped at Astoria, or just off Astoria. They hooked up a 25-ton derrick barge that had about 4 or 5 mostly local workers associated with the barge. And then she got underway for Honolulu. So she took it took a little bit of time for her to get there. She pulled into Honolulu Harbor on December 6th. Probably it slowed her down having to tow that barge. On board the Vega was the XO Satoli Hans, who actually was from Eugene, Oregon. And I think about that when I think of him being on the ship at the time of the attack, and even at the time the ship visited Wana. He was really pretty close to home. Eugene is maybe 100 miles, 150 miles from Wana. And there are pieces of his mail, mostly from this era, 42, 43, that are in the hobby today. He came back to Oregon later in his life, too. Another of the Navy ships that you don't think of is the USS Jupiter, because at the time, she didn't have a Navy crew. She was originally the Flying Cloud, basically a brand new ship. She had just been built. I think it was the Grace Line that she was built for. I'd have to check. And she visited Portland and other ports during her inauguration year. And then in the middle of 1941, as the Navy was expanding, she was taken over and renamed the Jupiter. So she had the Navy name. She was a USS ship, but she still had a civilian crew. And she retained that civilian crew until I think it was August 1942. So it's kind of an interesting thing. She was over in the area where the freighters were as well. In fact, the guy that signed this, Alfred Naumann, I ran across a piece of mail for him from 1944, 1945. I should have probably shown it. But he spent his whole career with the Grace Line, practically broke in every ship they ever had, I think, for 30 years. Another Navy connection to Honolulu Harbor was the net station. And I've clipped a little portion of the map. And there are no photographs of the net that was at Honolulu Harbor. In fact, there are no pictures that I've ever seen of Honolulu Harbor at or near the time of the attack. It's one of those things I would just love to run across, a treasure trove of things. But just to explain what the net was, it was a mechanized system that ran from Sand Island across to Fort Armstrong in approximately this location. And on the Sand Island side, they had a small component that was in charge of the net as well, but it was also jointly run with Army personnel. In fact, if the net had problems and they couldn't get it open or get it closed by the mechanism, the second choice would be to have the little net tender Kakano that was stationed at Honolulu take a whack at it and see if they could resolve the problem. And if that didn't work, they actually, the plan called for them to use trucks or caterpillars to try to force the net open or closed. The interesting thing about this is that it shows a mailing address, care of Fort Armstrong. So it's the Navy Station, Sand Island, Honolulu, care of Fort Armstrong. And this example is postmarked at the section base of Bishop's Point, which is way the heck over by on the channel entrance to Pearl Harbor. Administratively, the section base handled the personnel for the net station as well as for the net tender Kakano. But their actual duty place was here. So I find it interesting that I've never seen this before or since, where they use an Army fort location as part of the mail. I have another example from this same sailor where it's postmarked at Honolulu instead of Bishop's Point, but it's the same. He also gives the same Cara Fort Armstrong address. And later on in the war, as the Navy developed the postal system, Navy 48, for example, would be the Coast Guard in Honolulu. Navy 59 would have been the designation that you see. In fact, I believe I have an example of that from 1944. This guy, Walter Reed, was writing to his first cousin, and he came to Bishop's Point in October 1941 and probably was assigned immediately to the net station. And later references show that he was referred to him as a Pearl Harbor survivor, but I don't know his story. It would be really interesting to get a firsthand account of somebody who was either on the net tender Kakano or at the net station, just to hear it. Speaking of which, this is the USS Kakano, the only net tender that was actually assigned to Honolulu Harbor. And it's long been one of the most mysterious listings of any Pearl Harbor ship, Navy ship that you can imagine, until this photo was more or less discovered about 5 years ago. Nobody even knew what the ship looked like. And I was able to track down the family member of one of the original crew members. And he gave me 2 pieces of mail associated with his dad from when his dad was at the Asiatic station on the Tutuila in China. And so I have this in an exhibit. It's from an original crew member of later on the Kakano, but this is as close as I can get to having mail associated with any crew member of the Kakano. There are no known covers directly, but it's interesting anyway. This is the son, who was a former police officer, lives in West Virginia, and this is Carl Sickman, Sam Sickman himself, who was the crew member. He was with the ship when it was moved to Pearl Harbor in about May and June 1941, and then in October 41 he transferred to the section base itself. So he was not on board the Kakano at the time of the attack. After the war, well, let me say this: the Kakano was built at Port Arthur, Texas, for the Navy in late 1940, early 1941. She was built at the same time and at the same place that the net tender Wapello was constructed. Wapello was a bigger one. Kakano was about 72 feet, as I recall, and the Wapello was quite a bit bigger than that. But after the war, Kakano went back to Texas and worked the intercoastal highway in Texas and Louisiana under a couple different names. Southern One was the latest one that was used. I'm going to go forward and show you. One of the owners of the Kakano was Stuart Marshall, who, as it turns out, lives in Lopez Island, Washington, which is about 200 miles north of here. And I went up and visited him, and he has the commissioning plaque from the engine room of the Kakano, just referred to as the YN-47. And he was the last one that owned and operated the Kakano, and he would just had to give up ownership about 1977. And as she was tied up, I believe, in Galveston, Texas, there was a hurricane that came in, and a huge surge put the tug right on the freeway, and she was stranded there. And he heard about this tug stuck on the freeway and recognized what it was, so he drove down there. And as the workmen were breaking it up, he he uh, he talked him into getting this commissioning plaque out of the engine room for him, and gave him a couple cases of beer for it. And he still has it. It's quite a fascinating, and it's very heavy as well, I might say. So the pictures that you see, including this one, are all from Stuart Marshall, and they were all taken in the 1970s. This looks like an older picture, but it's not. It's 1973. These were while she was a civilian tug. This photograph is of a painting that was done during World War II by a sailor. It's now in a VFW halls, and it's a little bit mysterious on how or why the guy painted it at the time, but it's actually a fairly decent representation. And it's the only real wartime picture that we have seen of the Kakano, but it's pretty accurate even compared. Apparently, the Kakano really didn't change that much in its appearance as a civilian tug as well. Okay, the most famous ship, switching to Coast Guard here, the most famous Coast Guard vessel that was at Honolulu at the time of the attack was the Taney. She was tied up at Pier 6, where I think this photograph was taken. And I have several examples. I'm just showing a few of Taney. This one is from June 1941 by Eldridge. He was had been in the Coast Guard for a few years prior to that. He'd been down in Astoria on the tender Rose, and then transferred in 1941 to be on the Taney. So he's writing to Astoria, Oregon, where his wife was. And I was thinking maybe there's a big local connection, because I'm from Astoria area. My wife is as well, but turns out that there's not. He was on the Rose there. She was still there at the time he was on the Taney, but there was not a long-term connection there. Lovell Auto, they existed when I was still a kid. Another Taney example is from January 1942 and February 1942. For years, I couldn't figure out who this guy was, and I finally figured out he was Lloyd G. White, a sailor who on the Taney at the time of the attack. In fact, he was from Utah. At the time after the attack, he was reported by the local paper as missing. And strangely enough, his father had been in World War I in the Navy, and in World War I, the same thing happened to his father after he was reported missing in the local newspaper in World War I. So it's kind of an interesting coincidence. This is from a yeoman who was on the Taney in February 1942. I've always liked it that he put the little V for victory early in the war here. It's addressed to the boys and girls, just tongue in cheek, at McKenna's Cafe, where he apparently hung out quite a bit. He was later was an attorney, and unfortunately he was disbarred, and he was a city councilman, but an interesting fellow. Of course, Taney is today a museum ship in Baltimore. When we had our convention there a couple of years ago, I really didn't even see the outside of the hotel, much less have a chance to go to the waterfront to see the Taney. I did see it up in Seattle one time, because she was an active ship when I was in the Coast Guard, and spent quite a bit of time on the West Coast. Other Coast Guard vessels were crammed into Pier 4, which became quite a busy place. Originally, Pier 4 would have been the lighthouse service, and you see the Kukui right here. Um, but as the Coast Guard and the lighthouse service merged and expanded, a lot of other vessels were crammed in there, and they didn't have really room to put them. Just right here alongside, you can see just the front end of what is the only known picture of buoy boat CG 517. Um, just a boat that would go out with the Kukui and assist in more inland areas where they couldn't get the tender. This is AB 27. I think I was able to figure out that was a former health boat, health service boat that was brought into the Coast Guard and renamed AB 27. She became a fire boat during the war and had a different designation. This larger vessel here that the men are jumping off of into the water, that's the Reliance, the Coast Guard cutter Reliance, 125 footer. And then this is part of CG8, which was twice, it was taken by the Coast Guard in the 1930s, twice seized as a rum runner, and was named the Mizpah and the Rethan Thelu. But as the Mizpah, after the war, she was still in Hawaii. I even have a photograph of her as she was a fishing vessel. I think she sunk in the late 1950s. This is a cover from 1942 where they just made reference to being at Pier 4. Now there were some non-ship facilities at Pier 4 as well, and I have no idea what this guy was. As a seaman recruit, apprentice seaman actually. He was fresh out of boot camp. I have no idea what he did, but I sure wish I could nail it down. The Coast Guard cutter Kukui had historically been in Hawaiian waters since 1909. She and two other tenders and three lightships made a voyage, a little fleet they referred to her, from the East Coast around the Horn and into the Pacific and northward. And Kukui was one of those. When they got to San Francisco, roughly, or California, Kukui broke off and went to Hawaii. The Manzanita came up to Astoria, along with one or two of the lightships were up in this area. And the Sequoia went to the Bay Area. So Kukui had a long history. People that worked on these ships often would spend a whole career. They were civilians who worked on the ship. They had master mariners who were legitimate seamen with appropriate papers in charge. So it wasn't exactly a military outfit. This is the only cover that I'm aware of when she was still a lighthouse tender. All the other covers that I've seen are from 1942 and later, when she was actually a Coast Guard vessel. It's sort of sad that a lot of the people that had spent years on these lighthouse tenders and employees of the lighthouse service lost their jobs when the Coast Guard essentially took over. It was a merger, but it was in some ways and it wasn't in other ways. A lot of the crew member were sworn into the Coast Guard and became Coast Guard, but then there were exceptions to that rule for age or other reasons. Victor Goth was actually the first mate on Kukui from 1931 to about early 41, sometime after the merger, but it would have been in late 40 or early 41. Couldn't quite nail it down. He had started work with the Lighthouse Service again in Astoria, Oregon, and had roots working in the maritime and industry out of Portland and Astoria, both before and then after he stopped being on the Kukui, he went back to Oregon, and he was a pretty old guy by the time. He probably had to leave because he was getting up there in age to be considered an active duty Coast Guardsman. Milton Jones, I don't know a lot about him. I went to college up in this area of Ferndale. That's where he's from. That's his mother. And I think he spent a career in the Coast Guard, but I can't swear to it. He was pretty young when he died. He was some sort of a disabled veteran, and he was living in the Seattle area at the time he died. But the Coast Guard cutter Reliance, the first of 225-foot cutters that the Coast Guard had there. She would have been at Pier 4 at the time of the attack. This is a photograph, original photograph that I was able to purchase at one point. The other vessel is the Tiger, and they basically look alike. They were the same class. They were on the East Coast together earlier in their career. They both came to Hawaii in 1934 at the same time. They both served at Honolulu throughout the war, and they both went up to Keyport, Washington after the war, where they were sold. So they had parallel careers. Covers are pretty rare. I only know of one other cover besides this. Carl Studley, which I've said before is the best Coast Guard name ever for an officer. He joined the Coast Guard in 1920 and was a bosun's mate, and then was a warrant bosun. And up until World War II, guys like him, a warrant bosun would be in charge of a 125-foot cutter. In fact, Studley was in charge of a virtually the same kind of a 125-foot cutter down in the Coos Bay area of Oregon. And then after the attack, this is February 42, this is about the time he transferred and became the new CO. And they were just converting the old warrant officers to commissioned officers. Although he was originally from the East Coast, he spent his last years in the Seattle area. I didn't have a photograph of him, but I was up at the Coast Guard Museum, 5-6 years ago. And I was talking to Captain Davis there, who runs the museum. And I said, do you ever run into this guy, Carl Studley? And he starts thinking about it and says, I've got some stuff that the family donated. And he ruffles through his files, and a few minutes later comes out with several photographs of Studley's career, including one that I was able to crop a photograph of. So it was kind of a fun thing to do. The only other cover that is associated with the Reliance is this Akron disaster cover that lists the Coast Guard vessels and that were participated in the search for Akron on the East Coast, and it lists the Reliance. And I think according to the catalog, there's 20 of these, so they're pretty hard to come by. Coast Guard Cutter Tiger looks just like the Reliance. This is the only cover that I know. John Young owned it for many years and passed it on to me. I'm very grateful for it. It's one of my very favorite covers for various reasons. At any rate, the Tiger was on patrol on the morning, not too far from the entrance to Pearl Harbor, but just west of there. And she started tracking with sound equipment something that she thought was submerged, like a submarine. and they tracked it for a while and then lost contact with it. And it probably was one of the miniature submarines. Um, and after the war, she came up to Washington, and along with Reliance was sold. I lose complete track of what happened to the Reliance at that point. But the Tiger retained the name Tiger and became a commercial tug operating mostly out of Alaska, out of Vancouver, just across the river from where I live here. And uh, she was still operating in Puget Sound up into the 1990s. And she still exists as part of a breakwater at the Tyee Marina in Tacoma, Washington. I went up there about 6, 7 years ago and took some photographs of her, and she's not much to look at. Um, she still had some wood on her deck. What era it's from, I have no idea, but the superstructure is gone. The engine is out. There's a bunch of styrofoam stuffed inside to give her a little bit of buoyance, but she really is floating on her own in maybe 80 feet of water or so. And in fact, the Coast Guard cutter Comanche, the museum ship, ties right up next to her. And they had permission to take some of the wood off the deck of the Tiger, and they were selling it. You could probably still buy it, a $20 donation to get a little piece of the wood from the Tiger. I know I picked one up. Robert Wilkin, he became a photographer after the war. He wrote this letter to his older brother George, who also joined the Coast Guard during World War II. Switching to Army vessels, this is one of my very favorite Pearl Harbor ships of all time, and it's because it also has an Oregon connection. The Colonel P.S. Mikey was a hopper dredge put into service in 1914. She was built in Seattle, but she mostly operated out of Coos Bay, and but was based in Portland, Oregon. So she'd spend the winters mostly in Portland. She'd work at Coos Bay, the mouth of the Columbia, maybe north up to Grays Harbor each year. And I have because she was a hopper dredge, she looked like a normal ship. And every once in a while, she would go on a special assignment. A couple of times she went to California. She'd go up to Alaska on a special assignment. In 1934, 35, she spent a little time up in Hawaii, over at Kauai, and working on a project. And in November of 1941, she again went to Hawaii, with most of her crew being here from Portland and Oregon. And what her job was to work at Kaneohe Bay to help widen and deepen the harbor to allow the large oilers to come in and service the Naval Air Station that's still under construction at the time. But there are covers that are associated with the Mikey. This is the oldest one that I've seen, from 1916. And if you read through it, you can identify who the person was. And then I found that just a few months later, he died. And he was just a kid when he died. But he died of typhus, and he's buried in Portland, not too far from the Oregon Stamp Society, so up in that area. The longtime captain of the Mikey was Frank Brown, who was master of the Mikey from 1924 to 1940, and he died shortly before the ship went to Honolulu, or a year or so before. There is a cover associated with the Mikey at during her trip in Honolulu. And this is it, February 1942. It's from Charlie Haddix, who he was from Astoria. My father-in-law knew him, and he worked on the Mikey in the summer of '41, and he was on the trip when they went to Honolulu. He even wrote an article in the 1990s about the Mikey, which was really quite fascinating. This was one of several photos that he took. In this particular cover, he writes to a friend of his, Jack Sweet, on the dredge Natoma, which was the city dredge at Astoria. Apparently, during the war, it was working at other locations. They had Garibaldi crossed out, and then Astoria. Jack Sweet's father was the harbor master at Astoria, and I have a cover of him associated with the old lighthouse tender Manzanita that came around the Horn with Kukui. His father worked on the Manzanita back in 1909, 1910, and then became harbor master. So there's a lot of interesting connections to this cover. The master of the Mikey at that time of Pearl Harbor was P.J. Hansen, Peter J. Hansen. Quite a character. He was an old sailing ship master. He traveled, took red cedar and yellow cedar down to Australia pretty regularly up until 1917, when his schooner wrecked down in Australia. He'd take his family with him too. It was interesting. I've written a whole article on P.J. Hansen. By happenstance, his grandson, who you see right here, still lives in Beaverton, Oregon, right a couple miles from my house. And he shared a lot of family photos and things with me. Just a fascinating connection. But old PJ was 67 years old at the time. During World War I, he had was a reserve lieutenant commander, and there are pictures of him with his Navy uniform. Very proud veteran. But just before World War II, he reached the maximum age, so he couldn't actually serve in the Navy during the war. So he remained in charge of the Mikey, not only at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, but continued throughout the war. The Mikey returned to Astoria in April 1942 and was based in Astoria, and P.J. Hansen was on her that whole time. In fact, here's a cover from the Mikey in June of 1942, mailed from Astoria. Both of these are associated with the ship's clerk, Arthur Lomer. This one, I didn't know who Arthur Lomer was when I first found this. This was kind of the discovery cover of the Mikey. But I figured out that this was a dentist, and I figured out that there was somebody named Arthur Lomer living at this address with his widowed mother, and that he worked for the engineers. So I figured it must be Arthur Lomer, and that's who it was. And then here is a wartime cover from Arthur Lomer, or from his, excuse me, this one is from Arthur Lomer on the Mikey. This one is to Arthur Lomer from his brother. And it's addressed to Arthur on the Mikey at the address of the engineer office in Portland, which is right under the St. John's Bridge, by the way. And then they redirected it to Astoria. And on this one, the back actually shows the receive stamp that shows the name of the dredge. So I really like some of these connections. Another Army vessel that was at Honolulu, right? Had one's at Pier 24, one's at Pier 25 with the Mikey, was the Royalty Frank. This is a relatively famous one. It's usually referred to as an Army transport. And she was. Uh, she was sunk in January 1942 on the way to Hilo, the loss of several lives. Um, there's a lot of mysteries about her sinking that they still talk about today. She was originally a mine planner on the East Coast. This is the only postcard I've ever seen, and I was able to confirm that it really is the Royalty Frank. Right here, there's a nameplate on the side, and I blew it up with a I think 4,400 DPI scanner and was able to actually read the nameplate and confirm that it was the Frank. Probably had taken in Boston. She worked up in that area a lot. And one thing surprised me when I got the scan is there's a guy in the water right here. I have no idea what he's doing, but uh, she uh, she was, I think, mostly laid up after World War One. And in 1929, 1930, they moved her to Honolulu, no longer to be used as a mine planner, but now to be a small transport to carry supplies and men to mostly to Hilo. They had a big Army recreation area in Hilo, so a lot of officers would go back and forth. And I ran across this 1939 postcard, which has a seldom seen real photo of this, but this one's actually mailed by somebody who traveled on the ship at the time. And she wasn't very much impressed. She said, "How would you like to cross the ocean in this? Take it from me, it isn't very smooth sailing. It's just a little larger than a rowboat." And I figured out who she was. She was the wife of an officer, and the newspaper referred to them as uh, traveling from Honolulu to Hilo at that time. She mailed this to her brother. Another Army vessel was the General Charles Krautoff, who spent most of its career known as the tug Cuba. She was built as the Cuba back about 1902, operated from Boston in the east, or the East Coast, to Cuba itself, towing barges and whatnot, until World War One, when the Army took possession. They kept her name, and this is a real photo postcard of the tug in France transporting troops out to ships in the port. You can see some sort of a collier here. In 1922, she was moved through the Panama Canal to Honolulu. In fact, on the way over, there was an incident where a 37-year-old seaman got into a fight with the cook, and the cook killed him. So there was a murder. They had to stop at St. Augustine. The dead guy was buried there, and the cook, who was a African American, was put in jail. And I've taken several attempts to try to figure out what happened to that guy, but I've had no luck. But the gravestone of the sailor is still evident. I kind of wonder, since he was an employee of the federal government, whether it would have been a jurisdiction other than the Florida jurisdiction, but I don't know. It would probably take some real on-site time to resolve. You you can also get glimpses of the Cuba at Honolulu, where she did harbor work, as the big transports would stop there on their way to the Philippines and whatnot. Uh, the Cuba and a couple other Army tugs would assist in turning them about. So you can get a glimpse of her every once in a while that way. She and the other Army tugs would also do target towing for the Coast Artillery, a job that I would not relish. You go 8-10 miles off port, and even if you have a target that's a quarter mile behind you, you have guns that are shooting in your direction. I don't think I would like that very much. Another private tug that was under Army charter would have been the Matilda Foss. She was originally an Army vessel. The Barrett, built around 1909, and placed into service in the Bay Area up until the early 30s. She was sold, became a private yacht briefly, and then Foss Tug Company bought her and converted her for use as a tugboat. She went to Midway Island in 1939, along with several other vessels, towed by the Sirius and the Ramapo, with the dredge Holland, the tug Monterey, the barge Havaside number 5, and the Matilda Foss. I bring that up for a reason, because I'll probably do an article someday on those things. Two of those vessels were at Honolulu at the time of the attack, including the Matilda Foss. She is recorded as bringing the Havaside 5 out to the Key of Sanqua that morning to take over to Pearl Harbor, where she was a derrick barge that was needed for use over there. The crew member is Chandros Shaddy, who spent some time at Midway Island and then followed the boat to back to Honolulu. He's writing to his 12-year-old son. Shaddy later lived in near Salem, Oregon. Sorry, I keep bringing Oregon up, but it's just my mindset. Speaking of the Havaside number 5 derrick barge, is owned by Havaside Company of San Francisco, chandlers and dealers in anything maritime, rigging equipment and whatnot. Havaside number 5 was one of several barges that had special rigging that could carry especially heavy loads. You look at the rigging on that, it's extremely complex. I don't know anything about rigging except to recognize that. She was taken to Midway Island in 1939 and worked there, and then afterwards came back to Honolulu, where she stayed throughout the war. By happenstance, I have covers associated with 2 crew members on the Havaside number 5 that I can associate. When she was brought back to Honolulu, this article talks about 4 or 5 people that rode on the Havaside number 5 as she was towed from Midway Island. These same 2 crew members were on the musters as leaving San Francisco on Havaside number 5 as it went to Midway Island. So there's no doubt that these 2, both of whom were riggers, were actually working on Havaside number 5. And both these covers are associated with Midway Island. I think they pretty clearly knew each other. This guy had a couple legal problems a few years earlier. The yacht Valkyrie was a U.S. engineer schooner that was in the area of Honolulu Harbor at the time of the attack. This cover is actually sent by a crew member, Roy Olson, who was on the Matilda Foss when it first went to Midway Island. So there's a lot of interesting connections. There's not a lot known about the Valkyrie. She was built in 1928 in New Zealand of, let's see, what was the name? It's a Kuari, Kuari wood. She has quadruple planking of the Kari tree, which is a huge tree that exists in New Zealand. It's been protected for decades, which makes examples of ships that were built out of this wood and in that manner quite rare. And maybe for that reason, she has continued to exist. She now is in Panama. She's known as the Valkyrian, and I'd love to go down there and see her at some point. She had by its nature, had a shallow draft, which made her perfect for survey work, which is almost certainly what she was used for. One of the inter-island ships that was present at the time of the attack was the steamer Haleakala. Actually, during the attack, she was over by the section base at Hickam Dock, but normally she would have been associated at Honolulu Harbor. She was built for the Inter-Island Steamship Company in 1923 and brought out to Hawaii. I have this example. I did a short article for the log a year or so ago. This is a purser's mark from the steamer Haleakala in 1924. At that time, she was making regular runs from Honolulu to Hilo, and then would stop at Maui along the way. And although she was carrying bags of mail, what I figured out with research is that she had a sealed mail bag as she left Hilo on her way back to Honolulu. When she stopped at Maui, one of the residents of Maui handed the purser this envelope, and he took custody and put the purser mark on it. And then when the ship arrived at Honolulu the next morning, then the purser put it to be processed by the Honolulu postal system. This is also an example from 1926 from somebody who, this is a common postcard. But in this case, she says, "I'm on the Haleakala." She even draws an arrow to where her stateroom is. And you can follow them in the newspapers that her and her friend had been traveling on the Haleakala, and they mailed this back to a nephew in Hood River, Oregon. I actually had a piece of mail that I found on eBay once from the other person, also going to Hood River. Different. I mean, it was the postal stationery from the ship. I was so excited, and then the dealer couldn't find it. I never did get it, so it made me upset, but I was happy to find this anyway. Haleakala was laid up a good part of the late 1930s and was brought out in 1941 and put back into condition, and then was chartered to the Army as a transport. She worked out of the islands and in distant islands and whatnot. And I happened to come across this cover once from the USET. I think transport is what the sailor meant, but he was a civilian on board. Even during the war, these Army transports were operated by civilians, merchant mariners. This is the only cover I've seen from the Haleakala during wartime, with a civilian censor postmarked at Honolulu in February '42. This is a post-war cover when she was chartered after the war to a company in the Philippines. And in this case, she was carrying refugees from Shanghai to Australia. And this was written by a member on board. He says inside the letter that he's traveling on the Haleakala and gives the details of his situation. In the meantime, newspapers were wondering what this ship was and why was it coming to Australia, and who were these people, and there were all kinds of worries about things. And then rumors of the conditions on the ship broke out too. He was in the first class area and didn't suffer apparently the way that some of the others did. Interesting fellow, played the piano. Two other inter-island ships have philatelic covers. Actually, there's a third one from the Hualelai. Um, and arguably these were in the vicinity. They had regular routes that took them in and out of Honolulu. One of them was supposed to be arriving on December 7th, but details of where they were exactly at that moment is not clear. But I include them anyway. I think the Waialae was the sister ship of the Haleakala. Both of these are addressed to Captain Von Miller, who wrote for the USCS log at that time. He was in charge of the Merchant Marine articles for a while. I said that there was a floating dry dock and at Honolulu at the time of the attack. This is what she looked like. It's not this big crane you see looming ahead. It has nothing to do with the vessel you see inside. It's this dock. It doesn't look very big, but it's actually quite a bit larger than you think it is. She spent most of her career right over here near Pier 3 as you go into Honolulu Harbor. But at the end of it, she was way the heck over here around Pier 27, where you see her nestled in here in a photograph about 1940, 1941. And she serviced all kinds of vessels up to probably a couple 100 feet or so, large enough to handle the inter-island ships that the company owned, which would be even larger than that. During the war, she was in constant use and was still used after the war, but at some point in 1950, they towed her outside the harbor and scuttled her. This is showing her as she's being sunk. So this is just a real photo postcard that shows it. It's probably as close as you're ever going to get. I just thought it was kind of interesting. They called her the Hulana. One of the more exciting discoveries for me was a cover from the freighter Montgomery City, small Isthmian freighter, a little over, as I recall, about 400 feet long, who worked out of the East Coast and also out of the West Coast at various times. This cover is from 1935 when she just happened to be in Honolulu, and the sender couldn't have made it more clearly. SS Montgomery City, and he gives the New York address and even shows Isthmian Line. There are SS City of Montgomery. It's not that. It's Montgomery City, and it's Isthmian Line. So this is the ship that was present not too far from where the Mikey was, and at the time of the attack. This is a real photo postcard of Honolulu, and it shows, I think, one of the big young brother tugs, either in some sort of holiday celebration or commemorating the tug. I've seen the postcard before. I just don't know what it is. I also have a postcard from her maiden voyage in 1922 when she visited Vancouver, British Columbia. There was a guy named Cyril Littleberry who photographed everything that came in and out of Vancouver, British Columbia. And it took me several years to figure out who he was. I couldn't read his handwriting. Another freighter that was over by the Vega was the SS Diamond Head. This is clearly not a cover. There are no covers from the Diamond Head. She was built just after World War I by the U.S. Shipping Board and operated, chartered out as the West Errol until 1927, when she was sold to the Los Angeles Steamship Company and operated as the Diamond Head. In 1928, they converted her a little bit to add 16 cabins or 16 passenger. I don't know if it was 2 per cabin or whatnot. Try to increase their revenue a little bit. So it's possible that you could find something from 1929, 1930 that might be from a passenger on board. Crew member male is also a possibility. She would have had a small crew, maybe 20 people. But it's pretty remote. I did find this old schedule, a fare that talks about being able to buy a ticket on board. And if you look at what these prices are and what some of the restrictions are, this is pretty low end transportation. It was men only, outside public bath. You wouldn't have wanted you wouldn't have wanted to travel if you could afford one of the regular liners, which were wonderful. The SS Permanente was a freighter that was also over by the Vega. And she has a long history, built around 1902, operated between Seattle, Tacoma, and the Orient, usually Japan, for about 8 years until the company went out of business. They sold her to the Panama Railroad Company, which was a government agency. And she operated between the Panama Canal and the East Coast as the SS Ancon for most of her career. She was the first ship to traverse the Panama Canal in 1914. That's clearly her most famous event in her history. And in 1938, 39, she was replaced and was sold and became the SS Permanente Cement. And she carried cement along with another sister ship that had been with her the whole time, back and forth between California and Honolulu. And she happened to be in Honolulu at the time of the attack. I have a cover from when she was the Shawmut earlier in her career. During the 1920s, she had a cancel, and there is a north variation and a south variation that are possible. They're not real rare, but they're not real common either. I've occasionally seen one from a passenger during that period of time. What I don't have is anything when she was the Permanente. Even during the war, there were remnants of her passenger cabins that could still be used. And she was often used to transport workers back and forth. And during the evacuation of family members from Hawaii, she carried family members. I've run across covers where they traveled on the Permanente at some point, but nothing directly from the ship. Love to find that. One of the more interesting ships that was at Honolulu was the steamer Dickinson. She was owned and operated by the Commercial Pacific Cable Company, based in Honolulu, and she would transport supplies and exchange personnel at Midway Island and at Fanning Island, some other locations as well, but those were the two main ones that she's associated with. She came to Honolulu about 1923 and operated up until December 7th, 1941, when she was evacuating people, the families from Fanning Island to Honolulu, and she came into Honolulu while Honolulu was under attack. One of the people on board was Glenn Palmer with her 3-year-old daughter. Her husband remained in Fanning Island. He was an employee of the cable company. But during the times that she was there, before and then later after the war, some of the postal stuff that you see was handled by Glenn Palmer. And in this particular case, I think this is 1949 or 1950, she even adds a note to a collector who is writing for the cancellation. and she signs her name. She sends a little note to the collector and then signs her name. And so I thought that was kind of neat. I picked it up, and this is her on the manifest uh, of the Dickinson as she arrived at Honolulu on December 7th. And this shows her on the manifest as departing Fanning Island December 1st. And there's her, and there's her daughter. During the war, the Navy took custody of the ship. The ship had some rudimentary cable facilities to handle cable if they had to, but primarily it was, I think that's been overemphasized over the years. She was probably mainly just a supply ship. And although the Navy took custody of her during the war and converted her for use as the USS Kailua, honestly, they really didn't know what to do with her. She did go down into the South Pacific. She did assist with some of the cable laying functions for a period of time, but for all the effort put into getting the ship ready, I don't think they really got much bang for their buck. There is mail that's possible from the Kailua. It's not seen very often. This was an outgoing mail from a crew member in 1943. This is official mail in 1943. And this was incoming mail from a sailor to a sailor on board, just about the time he was being transferred. There's a book that was written by Mifflin Thomas in 1937, where he spent time on the Kailua, or then the Dickinson, going to and from Midway to Honolulu, and he writes about his experiences. Pretty neat little book. And after the war, the ship was towed out about 20 miles and sunk as a target with a torpedo. And they recently found the wreck, and it's kind of interesting. You can see the wheel this is from the 1930s from Mifflin's book. And here she is today underwater. Let's just stick it in. The Jagersfontein was a Dutch freighter that also happened to enter the harbor at the time of the attack of Pearl Harbor, of Honolulu. She and three other Fontaine ships were originally part of the Holland Africa line, taking passengers from Holland, usually stopping at Southampton, England, and then south to Cape Town and East Africa, back and forth according to schedules. In 1939, when Germany attacked Poland, the owners of the ship thought it was a good idea to get their ships out of harm's way. They could see the handwriting on the wall. So they moved Jagersfontein and the other ships over to the Pacific, where they operated. And these ships would stop at Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and then into the Dutch East Indies and China. They made a huge circuit. She came to Portland 4 times in 1940 and 41. I've got, this is mail when she was still with the Holland Africa line, where you can see they used the Bloemfontein and the Jagersfontein were identical, a distinctive bow, and they shared the same postcard. The only way to tell the difference is that in this case, they crossed out the one that it wasn't. And I can also find the name of the passenger on one of the manifests to confirm that this indeed was the Jagersfontein. This is on one of the trips to Portland, where this was hand carried on the Jagersfontein from the Netherlands. And when they reached Portland, it was put in the mail and sent the rest of the way to New York City. And the last stop, the final visit to Portland, was in January 1941. This is the only other cover that I've seen from 1941, just happens to be Portland. when you see Jagersfontein, often they are using these devices to identify the ship, the purser's stamp. My favorite is this one, which is postmarked at Honolulu from a passenger. This says care of the Java Pacific Line Steamship Company, Honolulu. And the only ship of the Java Steamship Line was, at the time of the attack, was the Jagersfontein. And in this Christmas card written by a missionary on her way to India, back to India, to her half-sister, she describes arriving at Honolulu during the attack, where they were outside the harbor. They saw these planes flying overhead. They saw splashes with what they thought was a mock battle falling into the water. They'd even clap. They were so excited. It wasn't until they actually reached the harbor and pulled up right here at Pier 9 that they were realized and were told that that was no sham battle, that was the Japanese planes trying to sink the Jagersfontein in the channel. And they were taken off the ship. They remained there for almost about 10, 12 days. And then the ship got underway with her and the other passengers. I wrote an article about that. It was a lot of fun to research and read. While they were at the dock, after arriving, the second wave of attack happened. So in some books, you'll read about the Jagersfontein throwing back the tarps over their anti-aircraft guns and then shooting as they entered the harbor. It wasn't that way. When she first came into the harbor, they were under attack, but there was no anti-aircraft from the Jagersfontein. That happened here during the second attack. And the reason I've got these marked here is that during the second attack, when the planes came, she did fire. And this is where the Taney would be. This is where the Vega would be. So between the three of them, they kind of formed a triad of defense. Besides that, there were shore installations with anti-aircraft guns in these areas as well. But for the ships that had significant power, that was it. I'm going to try to quickly go through. Oh my gosh, it's getting late. The YP 172 and the YP 226 were former sampan fishing boats that were taken by the Navy in December of 1941. At the time of the attack, they would have been in Kewalo Basin, just around the corner from Honolulu. And early in the war, they used a lot of these sampans for patrol boats, which is exactly what the YP-72 was. There's no actual photograph of the YP-72. And I've got some mail from one crew member as she was moved to Kauai in late 1942 for patrols. This one is from an officer. I don't know his exact relationship. I know he was not the CO. I think he might have been with the sampan unit that and happened to be on the YP-72, the same way that, say, the commander of a battle force would be on a battleship but wasn't the commander of a ship. Not sure. The YP-226 was the same sort of thing. This was from the sampan group. I identified Eric Robbie as belonging to the YP-226 at this time. He was from Hawaii and an experienced yachtsman and seaman, and even though he was a young man at the time, and he was at Bishop's Point during the attack and was commended for assisting ships that were entering and leaving the harbor. I think he was maybe with the signal tower at that point. The Ketch Sinjo was at Alamawai Basin at the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Interesting history. 47-foot yacht that was built by Joe and Cynthia Sever in Hong Kong. She tried 3 times to sail across the Pacific to California. In the process, they were arrested as spies by the Japanese and put in prison. They were attacked by pirates. Their boat wrecked several times, and they had constant weather problems. They made it as far as Honolulu on the 3rd attempt, where he was called into service and was later commanding officer of the USS Relief. He really knew what he was doing. He had been an officer with I think it was the Matson line. Or the President line, excuse me, for a long time. And she was an experienced yacht person as well. I've not seen another one, but this is addressed from Mary Bell to a former pastor who was in Hong Kong. The Bells lived in Hong Kong. And Michael Bell was briefly a crew member of the Sinjo on the 2nd attempt. So there's a lot of connections here. And it was a really fun article to research, if you remember that from about a year ago. And a similar adventure was this guy on the yacht Guiding Star. You see these cachets, always the same cachet, sometimes in green, sometimes in blue, sometimes in magenta, either from Honolulu or Hilo. There might be one from Tahiti, but he was quite an interesting character. He used several different names during his career. He's from California originally, spent some time in prison for fraud. After he got out of prison, he bought a little ship called the Walrus, a little 26-footer, was going to sail around the world with it. And he was used cachets, or at least something like that, to try and sponsor his ship or his trip. I found this one from the Walrus, and that whole project fell through. And so that he did the same thing with a little 37-foot yacht that he called the Guiding Star. And they spent most of a couple of years in Honolulu and Hilo, although I think it made it to Tahiti once, and the whole thing fell through. It even gives the address of Tahiti, but it's mailed from Hilo. Often they'll have letters inside that are typed. It's interesting. But he was, for lack of a better term, something of a flim-flam man. And I think that takes care of it. I apologize for running over, but I really enjoy doing these sort of things.